Picture this. You're miles from help, huddled inside a flimsy tent as a midnight storm rages outside. The rain drums so hard you can't hear your own breathing. But that wall of white noise is the perfect cover for a predator. Tonight, we uncover 3 true neighbor horror stories that will shatter your sense of safety. A shepherd in the Scottish Highlands watched a mud-caked boot slowly crush the tent fabric just inches from his face. An orchard manager realized her friendly neighbor was standing in the rain, patiently waiting for thunder to mask the sound of shattering glass. And a farmhand in Nova Scotia was forced to slice open his shelter and crawl through a flooded drainage ditch to escape a stranger dragging a rusted chain. These are not campfire tales. They are real-life encounters from isolated farms and remote fields. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and prepare to never view a rainy night the same again. The sound of moving metal. Ewan MacLeod had worked the Highland flocks for nearly 20 years, and he had never once questioned the isolation. Solitude was a currency he spent freely. The wind was his radio, the bleating of ewes his only conversation. But on the night the gale arrived, something shifted in that familiar emptiness. The forecast had warned of a brutal Atlantic storm rolling in from the Minch. The estate manager, a gruff man named Callum, had driven Ewan out to the furthest grazing valley before the roads turned to butter. It was a stretch of land called Glen na Scale, the Glen of Shadows, a fitting name for a place that seemed to swallow daylight. The job was simple. A flock of pregnant Cheviots needed monitoring in case the storm panicked them into the rushing burns. Ewan would spend 48 hours in a heavy-duty canvas tent pitched on a slight rise above the grazing floor. No farmhouse for miles. Just rock, water, and wool. By the time the wind began to howl in earnest, Ewan had already secured every peg, lashed every guy line, and triple-checked the waterproof seams. The tent was a fortress of nylon and paraffin-treated cotton designed for the brutal Scottish winters. He sat inside, cross-legged on a foam mat, a gas lantern hissing softly beside him. Outside, the world was a churning chaos of horizontal rain and screaming gusts. The canvas walls rippled and snapped, but the structure held firm. Ewan boiled water for a pouch of dehydrated stew, ate it mechanically, and then crawled into his sleeping bag fully clothed. The temperature was plummeting. He pulled a wool cap low over his ears and closed his eyes, letting the storm become a lullaby. Sleep came in fragments. The howl of the wind was so constant that his brain eventually filtered it out, treating it like white noise. But around 2 in the morning, something broke the rhythm. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rain. It was a sound of moving metal. Ewan's eyes snapped open. His lantern had dimmed to a faint orange glow. He lay completely still, straining his ears. The storm raged on, but underneath it, there was a distinct, rhythmic scraping, something metallic dragging across stone. He propped himself up on one elbow, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. The sound was coming from the east side of the tent, near the entrance. He held his breath. The scraping stopped. For a long, stretched moment, only the rain drummed on the canvas. Then, a heavy, deliberate footstep squelched in the mud not 5 feet from his head. Ewan's mind raced to logical explanations. It had to be a stray sheep, a ram that had gotten separated and was nosing around the tent for shelter. He had seen it 100 times. But sheep didn't drag metal across stones. Sheep didn't walk with the heavy 2-legged cadence of a man. He slowly, silently, slid deeper into his sleeping bag, as if the thin layer of polyester fill could offer any protection. His fingers found the cold rubber handle of his pocket knife, still clipped inside his jacket. He held it tight. Another footstep, then another. They were circling, slow, methodical, unhurried. The person, and he knew now it was a person, was walking a perimeter around his tent, staying just close enough to be heard, but never touching the fabric. Ewan counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The intruder was stopping at each corner, as if inspecting the anchor points. Then the metallic scraping returned. It was closer now. A grinding, rusted sound like a blade being drawn against a wet rock. Yuan's breath hitched. He knew that sound. He had spent summers on his grandfather's croft, watching the old man sharpen a sickle with a whetstone. This was heavier, duller, but unmistakably the same category of tool. Somewhere out in the drowning darkness, a man was carrying a farm tool designed for cutting. The tent wall suddenly billowed inward as a massive gust of wind slammed into it. The canvas stretched and snapped back. In that fleeting moment of distortion, Yuan caught the faintest whiff of something foul. A sour stench of sweat, wet wool, and rotting meat. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, cloying and sweet. His stomach lurched. Whoever was out there hadn't bathed in weeks and was covered in the remnants of something dead. The footsteps paused directly outside the tent's main door. Yuan lay paralyzed, staring at the zipper that separated him from the storm. It was a heavy-duty YKK coil, zipped snugly from the bottom to about waist height. Through the small gap at the top, he could see only blackness, but he could feel a presence looming on the other side, a mass of shadow and malice pressing its attention against the thin membrane of nylon. A flash of lightning split the sky. For a split second, the entire tent interior lit up in stark, bone-white light. And there, silhouetted against the glowing canvas, was the unmistakable outline of a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a heavy oilskin coat and a drover's cap. The figure was standing utterly motionless, head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. The lightning faded, plunging the world back into blackness and the roar of thunder. Yuan's mind scrambled to put a face to the silhouette. The nearest neighbor was an old crofter named Hamish Driscoll, a recluse who lived in a crumbling stone bothy about 3 miles east across the moor. Yuan had seen him only twice in his life. Once, at the estate's autumn gathering, Hamish had stood in a corner, nursing a dram, never speaking. The second time was last month, when Yuan had come across the old man repairing a dry stone wall in the pouring rain. Yuan had waved. Hamish had stopped, turned his head slowly, and offered a smile that showed too many teeth and not enough warmth. Yuan had thought nothing of it at the time. Just a lonely neighbor, probably starved for interaction. Now, in the suffocating dark, that smile took on a sinister new shape. The scraping sound started again, but this time it was right at the base of the tent. The intruder was dragging the metal tool in a slow arc through the mud, just inches from the stitched hem. Yuan could hear the thick, wet earth parting under the weight of the blade. It was a deliberate, taunting motion. The man outside knew exactly where Yuan was, knew he was awake, and wanted him to hear every second of it. Then the boot came. A massive, mud-caked leather boot pressed hard against the side of the tent, right next to Yuan's face. The wet nylon stretched inward, the sole's deep treads magnified grotesquely against the orange glow of the dying lantern. Yuan recoiled, pressing his back against the opposite side of the shelter. The boot held there for 3 full seconds, pressing and twisting as if testing the fabric's give. It reeked of manure and iron-rich soil. A small cascade of dirty water trickled down the inside wall and pooled on Yuan's foam mat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to unzip the back of the tent and run blindly into the storm, but a deeper, more primal instinct told him that to move was to die. Predators react to motion. If he stayed still, stayed silent, maybe the nightmare would pass. Another flash of lightning illuminated the tent. This time Yuan saw more than a silhouette. Through the water-streaked vinyl window panel sewn into the tent's side, he caught a fleeting, horrifying glimpse of the intruder's face. It was pressed close to the window, peering in with an expression of vacant curiosity. The features were gaunt, the skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. The eyes were pale, almost milky, reflecting the light like an animal's, and that same too-wide smile was plastered across the cracked lips. It was Hamish Driscoll, unrecognizable in his derangement. In his right hand, held loosely at his side, was a rusted farm sickle. The curved blade was pitted with age, but the inner edge gleamed with fresh, metallic sharpening. Clumps of something dark and fibrous clung to the steel. Yuan's heart froze. The stories. The whispered rumors among the estate hands came flooding back. 2 summers ago, a backpacker had vanished near the bothy. The police had found his tent slashed to ribbons, his gear scattered across a half-mile of heather. No blood, no body. The case had gone cold. Everyone assumed the poor lad had fallen into a bog. But the old-timers spoke quietly of Hamish, of the strange way he wandered the moors at night, carrying a lantern and muttering to himself. Nothing ever proven. Just neighbor stories. And now Ewan understood. The monster in those stories was standing right outside, using the storm's deafening roar as cover for another hunt. The zipper moved. Ewan heard it before he saw it, a tiny metallic rasp. The slider was being tugged from the outside. Not fast, not panicked. Slow, agonizingly, terrifyingly slow. The teeth separated one by one, a mechanical sound impossibly loud over the pounding rain. The zipper pull was down near the mud, meaning Hamish was crouching low, methodically opening the tent from the bottom, like a hunter peeling back the skin of a kill. Ewan's paralysis broke. He scrambled backward, tearing his arm free of the sleeping bag. His pocket knife was in his hand, the blade open, but it felt pathetically small. The zipper continued its upward journey. 6 inches of gap, 12 inches. Cold, rain-soaked air flooded the tent. He could hear Hamish's labored breathing now, a wet, gurgling sound through what must have been broken teeth. Ewan did the only thing he could think of. He lunged for the gas lantern, cranked the valve wide open, and hurled it directly at the widening gap in the zipper. The lantern tumbled through the opening and hit the wet ground outside. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a whoosh of orange flame erupted as the pressurized gas ignited on contact with the mud and rainwater. A brilliant, blinding bloom of fire lit up the entire clearing. Hamish screamed. It was a high, keening shriek of shock and fury. Ewan saw the silhouette reel backward, arms flailing, the sickle dropping from his hand and splashing into the muck. The old man's oilskin coat had caught a lick of flame, and he staggered away into the darkness, beating at his sleeve. Ewan didn't wait. He grabbed his boots and his heavy coat and scrambled to the back of the tent. With his pocket knife, he slashed a desperate vertical cut through the canvas. The fabric parted with a ripping shriek. He threw himself out into the storm, landing hard on his hands and knees in a pool of icy water and sheep dung. The rain hit him like a wall. The wind nearly knocked him flat, but he was out. He was free. He ran. He ran without direction, without thought, just pure animal panic driving his legs through the boggy terrain. The beam of his small flashlight bounced wildly over rocks and heather. Behind him, the tent was a glowing beacon of fire that was slowly dying in the downpour. He could still hear Hamish screaming somewhere in the dark, a sound of pure, unhinged rage. Ewan ran for 3 miles through the worst storm he had ever faced, his feet slipping in the mud, his lungs burning with cold air. He finally burst through the door of the main farmhouse just before dawn, collapsing in a heap of shivering terror and incoherent babbling. It took the estate manager an hour to calm him down enough to understand what had happened. The police investigated the scene later that morning. They found the burned remnants of Ewan's tent, the mangled zipper, and the unmistakable drag marks of a heavy chain, not a sickle, across the mud. The sickle was never found. But they did find something else, buried under a pile of stones near the bothy. A collection of backpacks, 5 of them, all from different hikers who had gone missing over the past decade. Each one was carefully emptied and cleaned, as if the owner had been cataloging trophies. And inside the bothy, mounted on the stone wall above the hearth, was a single, mud-caked boot. The left boot of the 6th missing hiker. The police knocked down the door, but Hamish Driscoll was long gone, vanished into the mist like a ghost. Ewan MacLeod never worked a contract on that estate again. He moved to the city, took a job in a warehouse, and slept with the lights on every single night. But he still wakes up at the sound of heavy rain, his ears straining for that sound of moving metal. The slow scrape of a blade through wet earth. The deliberate, patient footsteps of a neighbor who was never friendly at all, just waiting with a smile for the storm to hide his work. The predator in the mist. Sarah Jenkins had always believed that the most dangerous thing about living on a remote orchard was the isolation itself. She was wrong. The real danger wore a warm smile, brought you fresh-pressed apple cider, and lived just beyond the tree line. The Willow Creek orchard sprawled across 80 acres of rolling Washington hills, a patchwork of honeycrisp and gala trees that turned gold and crimson every autumn. Sarah had taken the job as seasonal harvest manager 6 months ago, fleeing a messy divorce and seeking the kind of solitude that only rural farm work could provide. The main cabin was a renovated farmhouse with a leaky roof, a temperamental wood stove, and exactly 0 neighbors within shouting distance. Exactly 1 neighbor, actually. A man named Dennis Brewer, whose property line butted up against the orchard's eastern edge. Dennis was the kind of neighbor who seemed almost too good to be true. He showed up the day Sarah moved in, carrying a welcome basket of homemade muffins and a bottle of local wine. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with a graying beard, and the kind of easy laugh that put people at ease. He helped her unload her truck, pointed out which trees were prone to dropping limbs in high wind, and insisted she call him if she ever needed anything. "Out here," he'd said with that warm smile, "neighbors have to look out for each other." Sarah had smiled back, grateful for the kindness. She had no idea that same man would be standing in the rain less than a year later, holding a crowbar and waiting for thunder to mask the sound of breaking glass. The storm hit in early November, a classic Pacific Northwest deluge that transformed the orchard into a churning sea of mud and wind-whipped branches. The forecast called for 3 days of relentless rain, with gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Sarah spent the afternoon securing equipment, moving delicate saplings into the greenhouse, and watching the sky turn an ominous shade of bruised purple. By nightfall, the power flickered twice and then died completely, plunging the farmhouse into absolute darkness. She lit candles and tried to settle in for a long, restless night. That was when she noticed the dripping. The roof leak she'd been meaning to fix had evolved from a minor inconvenience into a full-blown disaster. Water was pouring through the ceiling in the kitchen, cascading down the cabinets and pooling on the floor. Within an hour, the entire back half of the cabin was uninhabitable. Sarah grabbed her sleeping bag, a flashlight, and her phone, and made a decision. She would sleep in the yurt. The yurt was a recent addition to the property, a circular, weatherproof structure installed by the orchard's owner for seasonal workers. It sat on the very edge of the property line, maybe 50 yards from where the apple trees gave way to Dennis Brewer's dense patch of forest. The structure was sturdy, with a reinforced wooden door, heavy vinyl windows, and insulated canvas walls. It felt secure. It felt safe. Sarah spread her sleeping bag on the futon, lit a small battery-powered lantern, and tried to convince herself that this was an adventure, not a nightmare in the making. The rain began its assault on the yurt around 9 o'clock. The sound was thunderous, a constant drumming against the canvas roof that made conversation impossible, even with herself. Sarah lay in the darkness, scrolling through old photos on her phone until the battery dipped below 10%. She plugged it into her portable charger and closed her eyes. The rhythm of the storm was hypnotic. Slowly, despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach, she drifted into an uneasy sleep. She was jolted awake by a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was sharp, metallic, and deliberate. A scrape, then a pause. Then another scrape. Sarah's eyes flew open. The lantern had died. The yurt was pitch black. She lay completely still, her ears straining against the wall of white noise. There it was again. A grinding, scratching sound coming from the direction of the door. It sounded exactly like a key being dragged across sheet metal, or a pry bar testing the gap between the door and its frame. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She slowly, silently sat up on the futon. The sleeping bag rustled, and she froze, terrified that the noise might have given her away. The scraping stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only the rain. Then a heavy thud vibrated through the yurt's wooden floor. Someone was leaning their weight against the door, testing its strength. The reinforced door held, but Sarah heard the unmistakable creak of wood under pressure. She reached for her phone, hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. The screen lit up. No signal. The storm had knocked out the cell tower along with the power. She was completely, utterly alone. Her mind raced through the possibilities. A bear? No, bears didn't test doors with deliberate, methodical patience. A drifter's maybe someone seeking shelter from the storm, but anyone lost in this weather would have knocked. They would have called out. Whoever was outside was not seeking help. They were seeking entry, and they wanted that entry to go unheard. Sarah crept off the futon and lowered herself to the floor. The yurt had a single heavy vinyl window facing the door, covered by a flap she could peel back. On hands and knees, she crawled across the cold plywood, every movement agonizingly slow. The scraping sound returned, now accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking. Someone was working a tool into the lock mechanism, patient and practiced. She reached the window and pressed herself flat against the wall. Her fingers found the edge of the vinyl flap. She hesitated. Did she really want to see what was out there? But not knowing felt worse, a horror of the imagination far more paralyzing than any concrete threat. She peeled the flap back a single inch and pressed her eye to the cold, wet plastic. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in stark, ghostly white. And there he was, standing not 10 feet from the yurt, drenched to the bone, his gray hair plastered to his skull. Dennis Brewer, the friendly neighbor. The man who had brought her muffins and wine. He was holding a heavy crowbar in one hand, its curved end glinting in the electric light. But it was his face that stopped Sarah's heart. He was not looking at the door. He was looking up at the sky, his lips stretched into a wide, beatific smile, as if he were basking in the warmth of the sun rather than the freezing downpour. He was waiting for the thunder. The lightning faded, darkness returned, and then the thunder rolled, a deep, shaking boom that rattled the yurt's canvas walls. In that exact moment, perfectly synchronized with the roar, Dennis swung the crowbar into the vinyl window. The sound of shattering glass was completely swallowed by the storm. Sarah threw herself backward. A scream caught in her throat. The window didn't fully break. The reinforced vinyl held, but a spiderweb of cracks bloomed across its surface. Another flash of lightning revealed Dennis's face pressed against the fractured pane. His smile undimmed, his eyes now locked directly onto hers. He could see her. He knew she was inside. "Sarah," he called through the door, his voice eerily calm, almost pleasant. "I know you're in there. The storm is real bad. Just wanted to check on my favorite neighbor." The neighborly tone was more horrifying than any threat could have been. It was a mask, a performance, and the crowbar in his hand was the truth beneath it. Sarah scrambled backward, her mind desperately searching for options. The yurt had no back door. The canvas walls could be cut, but she had nothing sharp enough. Her phone was useless. There was no weapon, no escape route, no help for miles. She was trapped in a circular cage with a smiling predator circling outside. Another thunderclap. Another swing of the crowbar. This time the window shattered completely, shards of vinyl and safety glass spraying across the floor. Rain and wind howled through the opening. Dennis's arm reached inside, fumbling for the door latch. Sarah saw his wet sleeve, his thick fingers, and the glint of something else in his other hand. A roll of duct tape. He hadn't come to rob her. He hadn't come to threaten her. He had come prepared to silence her, bind her, and do whatever he wanted under the impenetrable cover of the storm. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a carefully planned attack, executed by a neighbor who had been watching her for months, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah's survival instinct took over. She grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a cast-iron skillet she'd brought from the cabin to cook on the yurt's small propane stove. As Dennis's hand found the latch and the door began to swing open, she swung the skillet with every ounce of strength she possessed. The iron connected with his forearm with a sickening crack. Dennis howled, a sound of genuine pain and shock, and his grip on the crowbar faltered. The tool clattered to the floor inside the yurt. Sarah dove for it, her fingers closing around the cold, wet steel. She scrambled to her feet and turned to face the door. Dennis was standing in the doorway, cradling his injured arm. The rain poured over him, plastering his clothes to his body. He was still smiling, but it was a different smile now. Colder, angrier. The mask was slipping. That wasn't very neighborly, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah held the crowbar in front of her like a weapon. Get away from me. I'll kill you. Dennis tilted his head, considering her. Then he laughed, a wet rattling sound. You think you're the first? I've been collecting neighbors on this property line for 15 years. The storm covers everything. The mud swallows everything. They never find a thing. He took a step forward. Sarah swung the crowbar wildly, forcing him back. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Scattered on the ground behind Dennis, half buried in the mud, were bones. Small, scattered bones, bleached white by the elements. Not animal bones. She recognized the unmistakable shape of a human finger. She didn't think, she just acted. She lunged forward and rammed the crowbar into Dennis's chest, knocking him backward off the yurt's small wooden porch. He stumbled and fell hard into the mud. Sarah didn't wait to see if he got up. She bolted out the door, barefoot, into the freezing, flooded orchard. The rain was a physical force, slamming into her with brutal intensity. The mud sucked at her feet. Branches clawed at her arms and face. Behind her, she heard Dennis scrambling to his feet, heard his enraged bellow cut through the storm. He was coming. He was faster than she was, and he knew this land better than anyone. She ran blindly, the crowbar still clutched in her hand. The orchard was a labyrinth of identical trees, every row disappearing into the mist. Lightning strobed overhead, briefly illuminating the path ahead. She veered left, then right, trying to lose him in the maze of apple trees. Her bare feet were cut and bleeding. The cold was numbing her limbs. But she did not stop. She burst out of the orchard onto a gravel access road. 100 yards ahead, the dark silhouette of the farmhouse loomed against the sky. Safety. If she could just make it inside, lock the doors, and wait out the storm. She sprinted down the gravel, stones tearing into the solace of her feet. Behind her, she could hear Dennis crashing through the trees, his breath ragged, his footsteps heavy in the mud. She reached the farmhouse door and threw herself inside. Her hands were so numb she could barely grip the lock. She slid the deadbolt into place just as a heavy body slammed against the wood from outside. Dennis pounded on the door with his uninjured fist, his voice now a wordless shriek of frustration and rage. The door held. The frame creaked, but it held. Sarah backed away, the crowbar raised, waiting for the window to shatter. But the pounding stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the relentless drum of rain on the roof. She stood there for what felt like hours, shivering in the dark, every nerve on fire. She did not move. She did not lower the crowbar. The storm passed just before dawn. The first pale light of morning revealed a world transformed. Downed branches littered the orchard. The driveway was a river of mud, and Dennis Brewer was gone. The only sign he had ever been. There was the shattered yurt window, the crowbar she still held, and the scattered bones slowly emerging from the mud as the rainwaters receded. The police investigation uncovered a horror beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. Dennis Brewer had been a serial predator hiding in plain sight, using the storms and isolation of the Pacific Northwest to cover his crimes for over a decade. The bones in his yard belonged to at least 7 victims. Drifters, hitchhikers, and one previous harvest manager who had simply disappeared 6 years before Sarah took the job. His cellar was a museum of trophies, driver's licenses, jewelry, photos taken from a distance, showing his victims going about their daily lives, unaware they were being hunted. Sarah survived. She carried the physical scars on her feet for months, the deeper psychological scars for much longer. She left the orchard, left Washington, left the entire concept of rural solitude behind. But every time it rains, she still hears that scraping sound. She still sees that smiling face turned up toward the thunder. And she knows, with a certainty that chills her to the bone, that the most dangerous predators are never the ones lurking in the shadows. They are the ones who stand in plain sight, waving from the porch, holding a basket of muffins, and waiting for the storm to give them cover. The echoes of the storm. Declan Hayes had spent his entire life on the Nova Scotia coast. and he understood the sea better than he understood most people. The ocean was predictable in its cruelty. It gave warnings before it struck. The same could not be said for the things that walked on two legs. The McClellan dairy farm clung to a rocky headland overlooking the Atlantic, a sprawl of weathered barns and salt-blasted fences that had weathered a century of nor'easters. Declan had worked there since he was 16, first as a stable hand, now as the night watchman during calving season. His job was simple. Keep the pregnant cows calm, assist with difficult births, and make sure no predators four-legged or otherwise took advantage of the chaos. The farm was isolated, the nearest town 40 minutes away on a good day. On a bad day, when the storms rolled in off the Grand Banks, the roads became impassable rivers of mud and salt water. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise, but the calving pens were down in the lower pasture, a 5-minute walk through wind and weather. When the forecast called for a brutal maritime storm, Declan knew he wouldn't make it back to the house. So he pitched a temporary canvas shelter near the pens, a sturdy army surplus tent that had seen him through 3 previous calving seasons. He stocked it with blankets, a kerosene lantern, a thermos of coffee, and a 2-way radio tuned to the farmhouse frequency. He was prepared for the storm. He was not prepared for the hunter. The nor'easter slammed into the coast just after sunset. The wind screamed across the headland, rattling the barn doors and driving horizontal rain that stung like buckshot. Declan huddled in his shelter, listening to the canvas snap and strain against its tethers. The cows were restless in the adjacent pens, lowing nervously as thunder rolled across the sky. Every few minutes, a crack of lightning would illuminate the entire pasture in stark, bone-white light, freezing the world in a tableau of churning mud and thrashing seagrass. The emergency generator was running smoothly, powering the heat lamps in the calving pens. Declan had checked it twice before hunkering down. It was a reliable old diesel machine, sheltered in a small lean to 50 yards from his tent. He could hear its steady chug-chug-chug beneath the roar of the wind, a mechanical heartbeat that meant warmth and light for the newborn calves due any hour. Then, around midnight, the generator cut out. The sudden silence was deafening. The heat lamps died, plunging the pens into absolute darkness. The cows began to bellow in confusion and fear. Declan swore under his breath, fumbling for his flashlight. A generator failure in this weather was dangerous. Without heat, a newborn calf could succumb to hypothermia within minutes. He pulled on his oilskin coat, grabbed his tool bag, and unzipped the tent flap. The world outside was chaos. Rain lashed his face, and the wind nearly tore the tent flap from his grip. He aimed his flashlight toward the generator lean-to, but the beam barely penetrated 30 feet through the driving deluge. He took a step forward, boots sinking deep into the saturated ground. That was when the lightning flashed again, painting the pasture in that familiar ghostly white. And he saw it. Standing perfectly still among the terrified cattle, the figure was massive. At least 6.5 feet tall, broad as a barn door, draped in what looked like heavy rubber rain gear. Its head was covered by the hood of a slicker, the face entirely lost in shadow. The cattle were backing away from it, pressing against the far side of the pen, their eyes rolling white with terror. But the figure wasn't interested in the cows. Its head was turned, locked directly onto Declan's position. Declan's blood turned to ice water. He stood paralyzed, flashlight beam trembling, staring at the impossible silhouette. The farm was 40 minutes from anywhere. The roads were flooded. No one could have walked here. No one should have been here. Yet there it was, motionless as a statue watching him. The lightning faded, darkness swallowed the pasture, and Declan scrambled backward into his tent. He zipped the flap shut with shaking hands, his mind racing. Poachers? But there was nothing to poach. Cattle rustlers? Not in this weather, not on this coast. His hand found the 2-way radio, and he pressed the talk button. "McClellan, come in. This is Declan. I've got a situation down at the pens. Static." He tried again. "Anyone?" "There's someone on the property." "Repeat, there is an intruder on the property." Nothing but the hiss of dead air. The storm must have knocked out the radio repeater. He was completely cut off. Then he heard the chain. It was a sound that would haunt the echoes of his nightmares for the rest of his life. A heavy, rusted clinking, like an anchor chain being dragged slowly through wet mud. It was coming from the direction of the pens, getting closer. Declan pressed his eye to the small vinyl window in the tent side. Another flash of lightning. The figure had moved. It was now standing just outside the cattle pen, one massive hand gripping a length of rusted logging chain. The chain trailed behind it in the muck, leaving a deep furrow in the saturated earth. The figure took a step, then another. It was walking toward the tent, dragging the chain behind it with a slow, deliberate gait. This was not a poacher. This was not a thief. This was a hunter, and the dragon chain was its calling card. Declan had heard stories from the old-timers, whispered tales around the potbelly stove during long winter nights. They spoke of a thing that walked the coast during the worst storms, a creature that was once a man, a fisherman who had drowned in a nor'easter decades ago, and returned to drag the living back to the sea with him. They called him the Chain Man, a ghost story, a legend to scare greenhorns. Declan had laughed at those stories. He was not laughing now. The chain clinked and scraped with every step. The sound was coming from maybe 30 feet away, then 20, then 10. Declan crawled backward, pressing himself against the rear canvas wall. His hand closed around the pocket knife in his coat. It was a pitiful weapon against whatever was out there. He had no gun, no axe, nothing that could stop a man that size. His only option was escape. The figure stopped directly outside the tent. Through the canvas, Declan could hear its breathing. A wet, rattling sound, like water gurgling through a clogged pipe. The chain scraped across the ground one final time, and then there was silence. The wind howled. The rain hammered the tent. And the figure simply stood there, waiting. Declan understood with chilling clarity what was happening. The storm was not an obstacle. The storm was cover. Every howl of wind, every crash of thunder, masked the sounds that would otherwise give the hunter away. And now, the hunter was waiting for the next thunderclap to make its move. He had to act before the thunder came. Moving as silently as he could, Declan withdrew his pocket knife and opened the blade. The back wall of the tent was pressed against a patch of wild rose bush that bordered the drainage ditch. If he could cut through the canvas, he could drop into the ditch and crawl away unseen. The chain rattled. The figure shifted its weight. A low, guttural sound emerged from its throat, something between a growl and a chuckle. It was savoring the moment. Declan sliced into the canvas. The heavy fabric parted with a soft ripping sound that was mercifully swallowed by the wind. He cut a vertical slit, then a horizontal one, making a flap just large enough to squeeze through. Cold, wet air flooded the tent. He could smell the salt of the sea, the rot of seaweed, the iron-rich scent of blood. Another flash of lightning illuminated the tent interior, and there, pressed against the front vinyl window, was a face. Not the face of a ghost, but the face of a living man. Gaunt, weather-beaten, with a tangled beard and eyes that gleamed with predatory intelligence. The eyes locked onto Declan, and the mouth twisted into a grin that showed blackened, broken teeth. The intruder raised one hand and pressed it flat against the window, splaying filthy fingers against the plastic. Then he began to laugh, a wheezing, high-pitched cackle that rose above the storm. Declan didn't wait for the thunder. He threw himself through the slit in the canvas and tumbled headfirst into the drainage ditch. The ditch was a 3-foot-deep channel carved into the earth, designed to carry runoff away from the pasture during heavy rains. Now it was a raging torrent of freezing, muddy water. Declan plunged into it with a gasp, the cold shocking the air from his lungs. The water was up to his chest, flowing fast, carrying debris and filth from the barns upstream. He clawed at the muddy bank, trying to keep his head above the surface. Behind him, he heard the tent rip apart. The intruder had abandoned stealth. With a bellow of rage, the man tore through the canvas shelter, the logging chain swinging in a wide arc. It smashed into the kerosene lantern, shattering glass and spraying fuel across the tent floor. A spark from the broken lantern ignited the fuel, and the tent erupted in flames. The firelight illuminated the intruder in hellish orange, revealing every horrifying detail. He was enormous, his rain gear patched with duct tape and stitched with fishing line. His hands were wrapped in rags soaked dark with old blood, and his face, fully visible now, was a mask of scar tissue and madness. He saw Declan in the ditch. He grinned again, wider this time, and took a step forward. Declan swam. There was no other word for it. He half crawled, half swam down the flooded ditch, the current pulling him along faster than he could run on dry ground. The water was full of debris, branches, rocks, tangled, bailing twine. Something sharp raked his leg, tearing through his jeans. He didn't stop. Behind him, the intruder was following along the bank, dragging the chain, its clanking now a constant, dreadful rhythm. The ditch curved around the lower pasture and ran alongside the old milk house. Declan knew if he could just reach the milk house, he could barricade himself inside until the storm passed. The building had a heavy oak door, stone walls 2 feet thick, and a landline telephone that sometimes worked even when the power was out. He kicked against the current, clawed at the muddy walls, dragged himself forward inch by inch. The chain was getting louder. He risked a glance backward. The intruder had stopped walking. He was standing on the bank, legs braced, both hands on the chain. And then, with a grunt of effort, he swung the chain out over the ditch like a fly fisherman casting a line. The chain sailed through the air in a glittering arc and splashed down into the water directly in front of Declan. The intruder was trying to snag him, to hook him like a fish and drag him back. Declan dove under the chain, the link scraping across his back. He resurfaced on the other side and kept crawling. The milk house was 20 feet away now. 10 feet. He could see the dark outline of its roof against the sky. The chain lifted out of the water behind him. The intruder was winding up for another cast. Declan threw himself against the milk house door, clawed at the iron latch, and tumbled inside just as the chain smashed against the stone wall where his head had been a second before. He slammed the door and slid the heavy bolt into place. The intruder crashed against it a moment later, pounding and screaming, the chain whipping against the wood and stone. But the door held. The walls held. The telephone on the wall was dead, but the building itself was a fortress. Declan huddled in the corner, shivering, bleeding, and listened to the echoes of the storm. The wind. The rain. The relentless, furious pounding of a man denied his kill. And underneath it all, the slow, dragging clink of the chain, circling the milk house again and again, patient as the tide. He stayed there until dawn, listening to the hunter circle. The pounding stopped around 3 in the morning, replaced by an eerie silence. But Declan did not open that door. He did not move. He sat with his back against the cold stone and waited for the light. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, and the pasture was a ruin of mud and scattered debris. Declan finally unbolted the door and stepped outside, his legs barely able to hold his weight. The calving pens were intact, the cows shaken but alive. The tent was a smoldering pile of ash and melted nylon. And there, pressed deep into the mud in a wide circle around the milk house, were the unmistakable tracks of heavy boots. Alongside them, a deep, continuous furrow, the mark of a chain being dragged through the earth by something that refused to give up the hunt. The police arrived 2 hours later, summoned by the farmhouse when the radio finally crackled back to life. They searched the property, the coastline, the dense scrub forest that bordered the pasture. They found nothing. No tracks beyond the ones around the milk house. No sign of how the intruder had arrived or how he had vanished. But they did find something that turned Declan's blood cold all over again. Tied to the branch of a dead spruce tree at the edge of the property was a length of rusted logging chain. And attached to the chain was a weathered lobster buoy painted with a name. The name of a fisherman who had drowned in a nor'easter off this very headland 37 years ago, the man they called the Chainman. Declan Hayes still works at the McClellan farm. He refuses to leave, refuses to be driven from his home by something he cannot explain, but he no longer works the night shift alone. And every time the forecast calls for a nor'easter, he locks every door, shuts every window, and watches the darkness through the rain-streaked glass, waiting for the lightning to flash, waiting to see if a familiar silhouette is standing among the cattle, waiting for the echoes of the storm to carry the sound he dreads most in this world. The slow, patient, inevitable drag of a rusted chain through the mud. If these true neighbor horror stories left you checking the locks and second-guessing every friendly wave from across the fence, you're not alone. The scariest monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live right next door, waiting for the storm to give them cover. Now it's your turn. Smash that like button if the sound of a dragging chain will haunt your dreams tonight. Subscribe to Mr. Whisper's Official and ring the bell so you never miss a single disturbing neighbor story. We dig deep into the most terrifying real-life encounters, the kind of neighbor scary stories that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the people living beside you. Drop a comment below and tell us which story chilled you the most. Was it the boot in the canvas, the smiling predator in the mist, or the echoes of the chain? I read every single one. Stay paranoid, stay safe, and always double check who's standing outside your tent when the rain begins to fall.